Master Donnelly taught us one day in school about the senses. We all have 5 senses, he said, except you, young McMahon. And he winked over at me. You have none. But for the rest of us, 5. He was a character, the big master. And the big head of grey hair, well groomed. But he was a kindly man. Some people said that the clear liquid that he sipped in the afternoons wasn't water. But I never noticed anything. But I would still remember the day he talked to us about the senses and about a poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and about how he used the senses to write his great poetry. Hopkins said that we, the human race, experience the world through the senses, and that when we experience something significant in life, it's the senses, smell, sound, feel, that we'll never forget forever. Well, I don't mind much about poetry about Gerard Manley Hopkins, but I still mind the big master saying that. Aye, the senses. It's the smells that never leave you. I can still feel them, if you know what I mean. Some people say that the eyes get used to the dark. But that's people that never was winched down 300 yards down below ground and then had to crawl 300 yards more. You see, damn all, just the seam in front of you, by the light of a wee candle or the flickering flame of an oil lamp that throws out more shadow than light. But you depend on that flame. But you take no comfort from it. For that flame could at any minute light gas, white damp, that would blow you all to kingdom come. Sounds is bigger down there. The grind of the machinery wincing you down. The trickle of water. The rasping cough of a miner. The tread of your big heavy boots. The laugh and talking of the men coming onto his shift. Feel coal dust and rock and wet slimy clay. You feel even through calloused fingers. Oh, the scurrying of a rat across your fingers as you go on your hands and knees on a tight spot round the duch. You taste the damp, dank air. But it's the smells, the coal dust, the sweat of the men. I smell blackness, always. You might think I hated the mines, but you're very wrong. Oh, of course, we were tired and sore at times, and you never forgot the water, the gas, or the black damp that would tear your lungs apart. But I liked the dark. I liked to feel that our coal fueled the fires in the houses and the factories and the mills. I liked it that coal was the sole reason the canal was built. And not just our canal. The first man-made waterway in Ireland or Britain. I like the way that the basin shaped our town. Coal made our wee town and gave us its name. Imagine that. I couldn't wait to go down, to join my father. I had my mother's heart broke. I was the eldest of 6. When my father would come in the evening off the day shift, black dirt from head to foot, and dead tired, I'd be looking out for him, and when he come in and sit down, I would go over and sit on his knee and ask him 1,000 questions. Till my mother would come over and take me off and say, leave that poor man alone, and him dead tired after a hard day's work at the maid. But he always answered me every question. Till he'd finish up, he'd say, son, you'll know all about it yourself soon enough. To me, the miners were the real men. Farmers and fishermen and labourers and builders and lightermen, they all worked hard too. But none of them left the world of light and sound and people to go 300 yards down into the ground and 300 yards more, where you could be killed at any minute, where the real light never shone. For years, my mother must have thought it was just the idle talk of a young lad with his head full of dreams. But by the time I was 14, I was more determined than ever to go down with my father. Oh, he never said nothing. He neither encouraged me or discouraged me. He kept quiet on the matter. But my mother made her feelings known. Nobody knows what's going to happen down there. Fire, water, gas, an explosion, black damp, or the whole thing cave in on you. And him only a lad. She'd woke herself up into a right state. Then my father would get up and put his arms round her and say, take a look at the lad. Look at the size of him. And the two big hands on him, like shovels. He'll be all right. And sure, hasn't he me to look after him? Then she'd calm down and stop crying. Oh, there was 5 in the house, younger than me. And the wages was as good as any going, and we needed the money. I heard my mother talking the night before I was to start walking down the mine, her voice shaking with emotion. Them old walkings, they're a death trap. They're full of water. My father told you there'd be men killed if they opened up the Congo pit again. My father just laughed it off. Do you think them engineers is going to let us anywhere near the old workings? Sure, they've maps and all for everything down there now. Them boys wouldn't want to lose a day's work, so they wouldn't sleep at night if they weren't making money. I dreaded my first day of work, evening actually. 2nd Tuesday of December. I didn't dread the hard graft or anything that might happen down there, but it was leaving my mother on the front doorstep. It was a cold, clear night, not a soul to be seen or to see me when I kissed her goodbye and hugged her. I can still feel her clinging on to me, not wanting to let me go. Till my father cleared his throat, and we're off. I never looked back, though my neck muscles was telling me to turn my head. I never looked back. You callous more than your hands when you start working in the mine. We walked the 3 mile from home to the Congo pit, from our wee cottage at Tyrone mill by the bridge where the torrent flows under. It was a cold, clear, star-filled night. The sky was filled with like 1,000,000 stars. My father pointed out the plough, Orion's belt, 7 sisters. Your head would have been dizzy looking up into the sky. If he was worried about me starting work in the mine, he didn't show it, as he lit the old tunes and puffed blue smoke up into the night sky. Puff, puff, puff. Just like a steam train slowing down coming into the island station. Just you get your bearings for the first week or so, son. Don't go wrecking yourself. It'll take time, but you'll get used to it. They're talking serious good coal in this shaft. There'll be a world of work for us both. I like the way he said, us both. And then he sort of mumbled to himself, if we can steer clear of the water. The men talked loud over the hard-working water pump and lit their pipes and savoured the last taste of tobacco they would have for the next clock of hours, then went and got ready at the head of the pit. They all wore moustaches and peaked cloth caps, who were just like my dad. All except one man, one big burly man, stern-faced, who had a big full beard. I hung round on the edge of things, a long, lanky gaunch of a lad who couldn't wait to grow up to be a man, to smoke, to cough, to crack in yarn, just like the miners. So the cracking in yarn was all part of the ritual. It was like my father said when he was a lad. You stood your full height, took a deep breath, closed your eyes before diving into the deep water of the first lock of the canal. You're welcome, young McMahon, says the man with the big full beard. The size of this lad, Eddie, he says. If he grows any more, he'll not fit in here after another year or two. And he smiled at me, put on his helmet and lit his lamp. I thought they were all old men. But looking back on it now, they must all have been only in their 30s or 40s. The other men were winched down by the engineer from Killybracky. He was by the name of Owen Muldoon. Me and Dad was to go last. The pit was given the grand title of the Emerald Pit by the owners, the Congo Colliery Company, mostly from Manchester in England. The local men just called it the Congo Pit. I nearly fell when the cage gave a sudden jerk and was started down. I clung on to the side. After all my big talk, I was trembling with fear. As we went down, the air was getting colder and it was getting darker. The cold frightened me and the darkness panicked me. I looked up at the wee patch of bright night sky. It got smaller and smaller and then was gone. Dad's lamp gave out a thin, yellowy light. When I heard him talking to me about the dukes and the shafts, I always imagined there were big, wide openings. But the shaft that this cage was in was barely big enough to hold the cage. Still went on down. Still it got colder. I felt my dad's big hand landing on my shoulder. It settled me in more ways than one. On we went down, the air got damper, and there was water trickling off the side of the walls, and far away you could hear distant, echoey voices. Dad disappeared into a spot of blackness. I followed him for fear of getting lost. If there had been a way of getting out of that place, I would have took it. I hit my head at dunt on the first beam into the tunnel. And I kept tripping on the rails that guide the trucks that took the coal out. I felt like a bloody idiot. I heard my dad's wheezy laugh in the dark. "Mind your head, son." I kept my head well down after that. There was barely room to stand anyway. And I used my hand to grope along the side. Still the water trickled under our feet, back towards the shaft. Dad was super. He was like a mountain goat going here and there and keeping me right, knowing when to turn, when to duck my head, when to crawl on all fours, going round a tight spot. We hadn't gone too far till we met two men with big black faces. They were obviously coming off us shift. They didn't know how lucky they were. We had to go into the side of the duke to let them by. Even then, it was a tight squeeze. My dad stopped to talk to him for a minute. The man near us, Dad, he looked very unhappy and kept pointing at the water at our feet and shaking his head. My dad nodded, and they were talking about someone like a borehole. I could hear a low rumbling noise in the distance. I didn't say nothing, for fear it was only my imagining. I didn't want to seem like the scared lad that I was. And then he was on the move again. I could hardly keep up with him. All I could see was the yellow sheen of his lamp bobbing up and down in the air. And then nothing. Just complete blackness. And then a gust of foul-smelling wind blew Dad's cap off. Wind, a gale, 300 yards below the ground. I felt Dad's rough hands lifting me, turning me, and pushing me back up the duke. And Dad shouting, "Howl the cage, men, howl the cage. There's water coming." You could hardly hear him above the sound of the water that was coursing behind us and would break in on top of us at any minute. Lucky enough, the cage was still there and the door open, and the man's hand reaching out to help us in. When I jumped in, I looked round and Dad was turning to go back up the duke again. But the men grabbed him and pulled him, struggling, into the cage, and the door slammed shut. They must have given a signal because we started coursing up right away. The water was still rising, but I was able to catch my breath. The engineer at the top, thank God he was still there. And we travelled on up. I can still see my dad, the two hands, grabbing the bars of the cage, looking down towards the duke, where the men were surely lost. Bar one man whispering a silent prayer, there wasn't a word spoke on the way up. I had never seen Dad without his cap on, in the house or out of it, all my life. He looked bare about it. His face was gaunt. I know now what he must have been thinking. What if he had been 5 minutes earlier? Could he have helped? Could he maybe have saved the men? What was it like for them? Did they even know what hit them? Why did him and the two miners stop to talk for 1 minute about something that they must have talked about 1,000 times before? Why did the good Lord save us and not them? Surely they had families too. After the quiet journey up to the top, it was all go at the head of the pit. There was a brief discussion as to what we could do to help. I couldn't do anything. I was only a lad. What could I do? Two men tried to start the big water pump to see could they get the water out, but the floods had fouled up all the machinery down below. One man, he was sent to get Monroe, the manager, tell him. Dan, two men, lifted ropes and ran out of the pit head. They were that quick, I couldn't even follow them. They came back 10 minutes later, heads bent, in no particular hurry. They had tried to get in at the old Congo pit side, but they couldn't get more than 20 yards in. The whole thing was flooded with water. By dropping stones down into the water, they established that the flood waters had come up about 70 yards. A foul-smelling gas like sulphur had come up with them. All was strangely quiet and calm. There was no emotion or grief from the hard-faced men doing their job. The grief and pity that would come later. The grief for the men, for their women and children, for their mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, that would all come later. The winter night sky was lightening into morning when I trudged home behind my dad and the big birdie man. They were walking and talking, and the talking turned to anger. There was mutterings about maps that wasn't right, too close to the old workings. Sure, wasn't that why they were closed? The managers knew. She didn't tell them. But they wouldn't heed us. Would they ever heed us? There was good coal there, a shiny black seam, and all the owners and the managers thought about was the money they could make from the shiny black seam. It's easy taking risks when you're not 300 feet underground. Them was the last words my father said to my mother that evening. If I want to work the mines, we'd better own them. And his big hands were cupped around a concoction of hot brandy and port that my mother had made him, something that only ever made at Christmas. And the eyes were blazing like the coals in the wee fireplace that we had. It burnt the cheap slack, and my father and his neighbours hewed out of the ground. But it was as if he wasn't there at all. And he wasn't. He was back down in that tumultuous water, bursting through the tunnel, wading through that water that should never have been disturbed, waiting to get to his friends and save them and get them out alive, safe. My mother told me to keep an eye on him. She threw on an old overcoat and scarf and wrapped up a bit of fresh bread and a bit of bacon and a drop of tea to go out into the cold December night to visit the new widows and orphans. It was well into the new year before the last of the men was brought up. My mother pleaded with me not to go. And then she pleaded with my father not to let me. But I couldn't be held. This was my story and I wanted to play my part in it. I walked with my father every day to the mine to see what we could do to help, to bring the men up. Sometimes we talked about it. Some days we walked the whole cut, where hardly a word spoke. But it wasn't until the 26th day of January, 1896, that the last of the men was brought out. I looked at the clergymen, the Catholic, the Church of Ireland, the Presbyterian, all standing at the head of the pit, close together and talking quietly to each other and nodding as each body was brought out. The very clothes was ripped from their bodies. The only thing that they had on was the boots that they wore on their feet. I tried and failed not to imagine the way they would have been hurled against the rocky sides of the tunnel and up against the timber beams and cut in the metal rails. I was never a religious man, not even as a lad. But I couldn't help thinking when I saw William Bretland being brought out that cold day of Christ, been brought down off the cross. They were all wrapped in white sheets and laid on the ground. Their skin, them that had skin, was like a grey-green. It was hard to picture, looking at these men, the strongest of men, to believe that they'd ever been alive. My father, of course, he had gone down to help bring up every one of them. I watched them as the last man came up, accompanied with the sound of praying, keening, and the sobbing of families and neighbours. The managers, of course, were seldom there. The very rails of the track was lifted and bent like horseshoes. Those were the words my father said to me one day, coming home from work, one sunny May evening. Can you fathom that? The darkness must have been lifting of him. The man that died was Edward Rafferty, age 42, fireman. John Cooper, age 56, collier. William Bretland, age 33, fitter. His brother David Bretland, age 31, collier. John McMullen, age 42, pump man. And young Frederick Mitchell, age just 21, weighing clerk. In time, we went back to work in the mines, this time in Anaher. And strangely enough, my mother never said a word to me. She just packed 2 lunches. And I started off by hauling coal in the wee trucks down the track. And in time, I went to hewing coal at the face with the other men. And I worked hard and made them proud of me. And I talked hunting dogs and the weather and whether the miners would ever have their own mine. and I smoked. And in time, I went with him on a Saturday night for a sup in Main Street. And I was happy and proud to be a miner. Oh, of course, there was the odd accident, but there was never another death in any mine that I ever worked. I mind as well as yesterday Eddie Rafferty's funeral, and us standing in Brackerville graveyard looking down over the smoking chimneys of Coalisland. There was no room for us in the chapel. The chapel was packed. Every denomination was present at all the funerals. And I looked over and I seen the big grey head of Master Donnelly. He nodded over at me, and I nodded back. And I thought back to the time at school when he talked to us about the senses, and how right he was about how some things happen in life, some experience that you never forget. The sight of the white bodies, the sound of your heart hammering in your chest, the feel of your mother clinging onto you, not wanting you to go to work in the mine, and the taste of dry coal dust, and the smell deep inside you, the smell, that black smothering smell that you always want to keep out of your dreams.
Miner's life is like a sailor's board a ship to cross the waves. Every day his life's in danger, still he ventures being brave. Watch the rocks, they're falling daily, careless miners always fail. Keep your hand upon your wages and your eye upon the scale. Union miners stand together, do not heed the coal board's tale. Keep your